He is a public health physician and epidemiologist with nearly a decade of experience in monitoring, evaluation, and research of programs pertaining to family planning, maternal and newborn health, non-communicable disease, human resource for health, primary health care, you name it, he has it. He's currently working as Senior Advisor of Monitoring and Evaluation Research in Japaigo and leading the MER team for Comprehensive Primary Healthcare Program in Japaigo, India. He's also a Japaigo-approved principal investigator with Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and have over 15 publications in international peer-reviewed scientific journals. So welcome, Dr. Ashish. And the last but not the least, of course, we have Dr. Sandre Yacuba. He is also an obstetrician gynecologist. So we have so many obstetricians gynecologists in our panel, and a public health physician, clinical teacher, researcher, and has over 20 years of clinical practice in reproductive, maternal, newborn health, and family planning, and specialized surgery. He has at least 14 years of technical consultancy with institutions, NGOs, international organizations, and have been teaching research in public health schools. Since July of 2015, Dr. Sandre has been working at Japaigo, Burkina Faso as Senior Technical Advisor. So as you see, we have a wealth of resources in front of us, and I'm really very excited to listen to their presentation, and I know you too. Just a reminder, each presenter would be given 15 minutes to present their papers so that we would be able to have at least 20 minutes at the end for some questions and answer. So without much further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Tina on the floor. Let's give her a big hand.
Thank you, Yolanda. Let's see. So I'd like to thank the committee, Yolanda, for inviting us to present. I'm going to be presenting evidence from clinical trial data addressing common misconceptions about the hormonal IUD. I'd like to thank my co-authors, two of whom are here today, Kelly and Margot. And I'd also like to acknowledge the clinical and regulatory teams at Medicines 360 who really lived this data for over 10 years. So the levonorgestrel hormonal IUD is now being introduced at scale globally. The hormonal IUD, this hormonal IUD was first approved in 1990 in Finland under the brand name Mirena, and has been available for 2 decades in high-income countries. However, it has not been available at scale in low and middle-income countries, largely due to the high upfront cost of the innovator product. So in 2015, Medicines 360 obtained approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration under the brand name of Liletta for its 52 milligram levonorgestrel IUD. This created significant momentum around the hormonal IUD becoming a viable contraceptive option for women in low-income countries. Shortly after that, Medicines 360 began offering it in low and middle-income countries at a low price. Around the same time, USAID started doing demonstration products to assess the feasibility of use in these countries. In addition, it was added to the WHO list of essential medicines around that time. In 2018, we started getting readouts of the feasibility of this method, showing that women were satisfied and had high continuation with it. And then in 2020, the Hormonal IUD Access Group was launched. This is a coalition of stakeholders that are trying to support the introduction and scale up of the hormonal IUD in low and middle income countries. And then finally, in 2021, Medicines 360 and the innovator products were added to the global procurement catalogs, and Medicines 360 announced that it would subsidize further lower the price of the IUD by subsidizing it to public entities through 2024. Scale up of this method, however, may be hindered by common misconceptions about the hormonal IUD. For example, there's some providers and women believe that the IUD cannot be used in nulliparous women, and that the IUD may have harmful effects for fertility. So beginning in 2009, Medicines 360 began conducting the Access IUS clinical trial. And in addition to evaluating the safety and efficacy needed for the regulatory approvals, Medicines 360 had a secondary goal of demonstrating or really dispelling some of the common myths and addressing some of the common concerns that women and providers may have about using this IUD. The hypothesis is that this rigorous clinical data would be helpful to providers to be able to expand access to this method for different women. So the Access IUD trial included a diverse cohort of U.S. women, of whom more than half were nulliparous. So these are women who had not had children. And this is in a contrast to previous trials which did not include nulliparous women. The population of over 1,700 women was reflective of the diversity of the U.S. population. And again, this is in contrast to previous trials that were conducted in Europe and the U.S. and had fairly homogeneous populations. In addition, the Access IUD trial also enrolled a range of women, including women who were heavier. And again, as mentioned, 58% were nulliparous. There was successful IUD placement in 1,700 of those women, about 98% of that women, and that was regardless of weight and parity. So as mentioned, this study was designed to evaluate safety and efficacy, but the secondary outcomes that were also evaluated included pelvic infection, including endometritis and PID, and specifically under a protocol which was designed to allow insertion without having STI results at the time of insertion. And this is in contrast. Typical clinical trials, you have a screening visit where women get numerous tests, including STI tests. Those results come back, and then women return for the insertion visit. So this was really innovative for a clinical trial. The study also assessed expulsion rates and bleeding patterns, including amenorrhea, which is defined in this study as no bleeding or spotting for 90 continuous days. And then finally, one of the other important outcomes that clinicians and women may be concerned about is return of menses and fertility after discontinuation of the method. So I'm just going to go through the key results from this study and highlight how these important findings can influence providers and serve to break down some of these barriers that may hinder women from starting it. So for infection risk, 80% of the participants in this trial did not have STI test results at the time of insertion of the IUD. And so of the 1,684 participants who were tested at the time of IUD insertion, there were 23 positive test results, so really low. All of these women were treated with the IUD in place, and none of them developed pelvic infections. And then over the 2 years that women were followed, less than 1% of women developed pelvic infections, and over half of those infections were more than 6 months after insertion. So these were acquired infections. Expulsion. There were 50 expulsions. There were 65 expulsions that occurred over the 6 years of the clinical trial, and that's about 4% of the participants. 50 of those, so the vast majority, occurred in the first year after insertion. And interestingly, expulsions occurred more frequently in Paris women, in women who had children, than in women who were nulliparous. And this is an important finding for the study. For menstrual bleeding patterns, amenorrhea, that is absence of periods for 90 days, occurred in 19%, so approximately 1 in 5 women in the first year of use. And those proportions increased over time, such that at 2 years it was 27%, at 3 years it was 37%. And over the actually entire study through 8 years of use, it remained at about a little over a third of women have amenorrhea or no periods. So what the study wanted to evaluate is what happens after you discontinue this IUD. So of the 664 participants who were evaluated for return of menses, means they were followed for a year after they discontinued their IUS, 98%, actually 99.4% had return of menses within 3 months of discontinuation of the IUD. In terms of return to fertility, there were 165 participants who attempted to conceive after having the IUD for up to 5 years. And what they found is that 86% of those participants conceived within 1 year. And this is comparable to what we see in women who do not use IUD or actually use other reversible methods like birth control pills. And importantly, what they found is that this 12-month conception rate didn't differ for women who had children and women who didn't have children, and it didn't differ by the length of time that women had the IUD. So if they had it for 1 year or if they had it for 5 years, they still had comparable return to fertility. So overall, the Access IUD trial addresses really misconceptions and concerns that providers may have that may serve as barriers to uptake. So for infections, what we found is that in patients who didn't have clinical evidence of infection, who were not tested at the time of screening, that was totally reasonable. Infection rates were low, and of women who did have an infection, they were able to be treated with the IUD in place. And this is really important in clinical settings where you want to see a patient and maybe do an insertion on the same day. There isn't a need to do testing if that's indicated by protocols and then have a woman come back for her IUD. And then for expulsions, we found that the rates were really low, 4% over 6 years of use. And this occurred most frequently in the first year, but the rates were not higher in nulliparous women. And this is really counter to the misconception that some people may have that the nulliparous uterus may not be as accommodating of the IUD. And then finally, menstrual bleeding. While there's this side effect, some consider a benefit, of decrease in menstrual blood flow for the hormonal IUD, we see that with discontinuation, there's prompt return to menses within 3 months. And this is also accompanied by rapid return or return to fertility for normal rates, such that women are able to conceive within the year as we would expect for women who did not use this method. So overall, these findings should really be helpful to providers and women who are interested in using this method but may have concerns about the safety. That is all, and I think I will wait till the end and take questions with the rest of the group. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Do you want to? Oh, is he doing it? Great.
Thank you very much. My name is Auminde Jafet Achola, as has been mentioned. I'm going to be presenting to you a study that we did It's a desk review on how countries have codified the WHO recommendations on task sharing, particularly for the long-acting and permanent methods. This is how I've organized my presentation. I won't go into the details of that. So as a background, task sharing is defined as a systematic distribution of tasks, especially counseling and services that are offered to clients to a wide range of cadres of healthcare providers to address shortages in human resources, which is a common problem in the low and middle income countries in the region. It is a high impact practice that has been promoted for addressing those human resources gaps that I've mentioned. And about a decade ago, and 5 years later, WHO published global guidance documents on task sharing, which were to be adapted by countries to improve or address the shortages of human resource. Around the same time, we were at 2012 when we had countries making commitments at FP 2020 to increase and expand access to family planning and, of course, use of family planning. And that should have been high quality, voluntary, and a wide range of methods to allow choices. Countries have adapted this, and they used task sharing as one of the strategies to expand access over that period of time up to 2020. Now, if you look at literature, after the publishing of these global guidance documents, there's limited information as to the extent of which countries have adopted those guidelines from the global level into their national documents. The Momentum Safe Surgery in Obstetrics and Family Planning is a project that is funded by USAID, and we conducted a desk review in 7 countries where we are working. Actually, there are 9 countries, but we did focus on the 7 countries. The aim of this study was to document the extent of which countries have codified the WHO recommendations into their national policy and guidance documents and operationalized those commitments. We also wanted to find out if there were barriers and other opportunities that would enhance access to a wide range of methods. Here we were focusing only on the permanent methods. So what were our main questions? We were to respond to the following. What is the status of task sharing in the implementation countries? Which cadres within and outside the WHO recommendations are allowed to provide long-acting, reversible, and permanent methods of contraceptions in the countries? To what extent is task sharing recommendations codified into or adapted into the other similar national documents, like training curriculum, scopes of practice in the countries? And then we also added this component, which is related to surgery, is how frontline workers were deployed in the pre and post surgical tasks in relation to particularly provision of the permanent methods of contraception. In terms of the methodology, I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but just to say that the task sharing included a review of literature. This was sourced globally from different search engines, and also national guidance documents which were retrieved from the countries. The countries included Democratic Republic of Congo, India, Mali, Mozambique, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Senegal. The study was took place over a period of 6 months, beginning in June last year and ending in November. Our data was mainly retrieved from national policy guidelines, policy documents, guidelines, standards and norms, training curricula, scopes of practice for the relevant cadres guided by the WHO guidance document. We also sourced for the global literature from using PubMed and Google searches. These documents which were retrieved were then systematically, of course, we had to go through an eligibility process, and then they were systematically reviewed to determine the status of LACs and PM in each country, consistency across the documents for each country, comparison across countries, and also if there were barriers and opportunities for expanding access to LACs and PMs. In terms of the results, we had 42 documents from the national, from the countries, and of those 42 documents, 32 were eligible. I won't go into the details of the criteria, but we can discuss that later. In terms of scopes of practice, those are documents that we thought we could easily access them, but we could only access those scopes of practice for nurses, midwives and clinicians from 2 countries, that is India and Rwanda out of the 7. And then what we also found was that quite a number of those national documents which were retrieved, although they were supposed to be current, they were actually outdated. More than 5 years, and some of the content had really been overtaken by what evidence had been brought on board, including the eligibility criteria, etc. Nigeria was the only country that had a standalone task sharing policy document. The rest had integrated task sharing into the national policy norms, guidelines, and standards. Looking at the status of task sharing, we looked at country-level guidance that was consistent with the WHO task sharing recommendations. And one, as expected, task sharing and for permanent and long-acting methods was actually articulated in all the policy norms and standards and protocols. Cadre definition or category of the different frontline cadres was consistent with the WHO recommendations across the countries. LACs was provided by mid-level providers, again consistent with the WHO recommendations across all the countries. Permanent methods, which is also supposed to be provided by mid-level providers, was also consistent, but only in 2 countries out of the 7. I must mention here that not all the countries have this particular cadre within their workforce. So there were only 3 countries which had this cadre, and 2 of them were consistent with the WHO recommendations. Country-level guidance that was not consistent with the WHO recommendations was we had policies and norms where provision of LACs and implants were to be provided by lay workers, and in another country they were to be provided by pharmacists. And then there were other also findings in that provision of LACs was only to be provided in designated facilities, which were healthcare facilities. This is consistent with the WHO recommendations where sterility can be guaranteed in such provision, and therefore client safety. And secondly, it was quite evident that trainings and roles of the different cadres who were involved in LACs and PM's provision varied significantly across countries, and I will be mentioning a few of these as we go through the results. Now, cadres within and outside the WHO recommendations allowed to provide LACs was the other question that we were responding to. And within the WHO recommendations, the cadres that are allowed to provide LACs in all the countries were as follows: nurses, midwives, clinicians, and doctors of complementary medicine. Doctors of complementary medicine is a cadre that is more in this region, in the southern and central Asia region, and they are recognized providers. So they are allowed to provide LACs. All cadres across the health sector were allowed, if they were trained, to counsel and provide information on all methods. And then in terms of mid-level providers offering permanent methods, the medical assistants and the technico de chirurgia were allowed to provide PMs in only 2 countries, that is in Mali and Mozambique. Cadres outside the WHO recommendations, as I mentioned, the trained community extension workers and the community health officers, by category, they are lay workers. And by WHO definition, they were, broadly not to provide this. They actually in red are red X. However, if you look at the Nigeria community health extension worker, she's a very different person. She goes through a 3 and 3.5 years training. She is qualified with a diploma, similar to a nurse. And she spends 70% of her time at a health facility providing services. So although she, by definition, she's outside, she's actually by qualification somehow within a different bracket. And then pharmacists were also allowed to provide implant insertion and removal in Rwanda. Cadres within the WHO recommendations who were not allowed to provide LACs or PMs are non-specialist doctors in Senegal were not allowed to provide vasectomy. This is not consistent. And then clinical officers in Rwanda, who are mid-level providers, were not also allowed to provide permanent methods in Rwanda. Again, not consistent with WHO recommendations. And then we looked at the extent of which the policy guidance documents were translated into training resources and articulated into their scopes of practice and scopes of work. Across all countries, there was consistency. The tasks that were shared were actually within their training curriculums, and that cadre was one of the cadres eligible to be trained using that curricula. There was some inconsistency across the different national documents, however, in some countries. And I've shared some of these. Like in Mali, there were documents where post-abortion IUD was articulated and the cadres that could provide that, but that was not consistent with across the training curriculum, etc. And then in Senegal, The senior health technician cadre was also not consistently mentioned across the national documents. And then in Rwanda, pharmacists were also not consistently mentioned in all the documents. For example, a training document categorically contradicted what was in the national norms and standards by saying pharmacists are not to be trained as providers of drugs. We also looked at deployment of frontline workers. This is because when we are looking at task sharing, the general view is that who can perform the procedure. But when you look at it, the holistic aspect of it, to provide a whole range of methods, you need a team. So as you task share this, what are the roles of the other team members in that scenario? So one of the aspects was that nurses were mostly assigned to counseling, client preparation for procedure. They also provided the procedures in the cases of LACs, but for permanent methods, they assisted the surgeons in the operative evaluation, during the procedure, management of emergency, in recovering the client, discharge and follow-up, and also in management of the procedure area. However, these deployment roles were not quite consistently articulated in the various documents. In barriers and opportunities, we have several systemic barriers, and when we went through the literature, we had quite a number in terms of supervision, in terms of supplies, equipment, availability, and other service delivery related issues. But there were others which were outstanding, but they were not task sharing related. And these were, one, there were medical barriers actually. The age, marital status, and number of children requirements for clients to be eligible for female sterilization. This was in India. We know India has a very high uptake of female sterilization, but quality demands that clients' rights are respected throughout, so they have a right to decide, and we should not impose these barriers. In Rwanda, we had spousal consent required, and if spousal consent or the woman or client did not have a spouse, then they were expected to go to the administration to countersign. Again, this is a human right issue and an aspect of quality, and we feel that should be addressed. It's a barrier. There were also opportunities, some of them I had mentioned earlier. Trained non-specialized doctors and clinical officers in Senegal and Rwanda can actually provide permanent methods, thus increasing the range of methods. There was also indemnity cover that is practiced in India for providers, and it provides them with protection against litigation and others, irrespective of whichever cadre, as long as they are family planning providers. That includes even contraceptive failure. And this is a motivating factor, and we would like to see the effectiveness and probably replicability and how it could be rolled out in other low and middle income countries. We have made several recommendations in this study. We would like to conduct an in-depth analysis of policies, protocols, and standards for task sharing in selected countries, and we'll probably be moving ahead with that. And then for countries that we identified as having outdated policies and norms in place, we will be advocating for them to update those using the current evidence, and then conduct further analysis on the indemnity cover, as I had mentioned earlier, to see how it is effective and how it can be replicated. Support countries to address inconsistencies. Of course, there's a WHO guidance on how to do all this and minimize inconsistencies across various guidance documents, and probably those are some of the tools that we will be supporting. Conduct further analysis on task sharing barriers and enablers, including other access barriers. We understand WHO is already undertaking this recommendation. Maybe it happened parallel, maybe, I don't know, but they are already on board working on it. And then advocate for removal of medical barriers that are included in policy norms and protocols, which we identified in the countries we are supporting. Thank you.
So, good morning, everyone. I am Ashish. For those who joined us late, I am Ashish Srivastava, Senior Advisor, Monitoring, Evaluation and Research with JPIGO India. And I'm going to present findings from a mixed method study that we conducted to evaluate the use of Saint-Romain as a family planning method among new users in India. So to give a little bit of background, until recently, the basket of choices in India's National Family Program was limited to 5 methods, 3 of which were spacing methods, combined oral contraceptive pills, condoms, and copper IUDs, and 2 limiting methods, male and female sterilization. In 2016, Government of India took the policy decision and added newer proven contraceptive methods to the basket, and one among them was Saint-Romain, which is once a week non-hormonal, non-steroidal oral contraceptive pill. Saint-Romain or Chaya, the brand name is Chaya, by which it is popularly known in the community, has a very unique dosing pattern. It is taken twice a week in the first 3 months, and these 2 days are fixed days with an interval of 3 days, and thereafter it is taken once a week. The USAID funded maternal and child survival program in India undertook an 18-month pilot project to introduce this new pill in 52 public health facilities in 5 states across India. And the purpose was to generate key evidences and insights around uptake and use of this method, which could then further inform the program strategies. Continuation rates of contraceptives are increasingly coming under focus, specifically in the context of Asia, because there is evidence to suggest that method discontinuation and method failures are actually responsible for more than half of the unwanted pregnancies. So we conducted this study with the primary objective of determining 6-month continuation rate of Saint-Romain among new users in India. And we also had a number of secondary objectives, like to determine the adherence rate to Saint-Romain, identifying and assessing the reasons for discontinuation among those who had discontinued the method within 6 months of period, assess switching patterns amongst those who had discontinued the method, and also understand individual and facility level facilitators and barriers to uptake and use of the method. So we conducted a mixed method study which had both quantitative and qualitative components. The quantitative component was a prospective cohort wherein we enrolled acceptors and then followed up telephonically with them at 3 time points till 6 months of time. So the first follow-up was done at 1 month, second at 3 months, and the last follow-up at 6 months. And the qualitative component included in-depth interviews with some key stakeholders. The study was done in 20 public health facilities, which were chosen randomly from among the 52 public health facilities where the project was supported. It was conducted from November 2017 to October 2018. The estimated sample size for the quantitative component was 200 acceptors, and for the qualitative component, we conducted 10 in-depth interviews with government program managers at state level as well as at the district level. 15 in-depth interviews with health service providers, those who were involved in provision of the services. These included doctors, nurses, FP counselors, and also 10 in-depth interviews with beneficiaries. And these beneficiaries included both those who had continued the method till 6 months and those who had discontinued within 6 months. In terms of tools, for the quantitative component, we used a pre-tested semi-structured questionnaire, and it collected information regarding the method continuation, the experiences of beneficiaries with the method, if they discontinued, what was the reason for discontinuation, and the questionnaire which was used at the first follow-up at 1 month also included questions around socio-demographic characteristics, whether they had ever used a family planning method before, their knowledge of Centromen and other family planning methods, and their feedback on the type and the quality of counseling which was provided to them before they accepted the method. The qualitative component had guides for each of the stakeholders. So with the beneficiaries or clients, we explored questions related to what were the reasons for choosing the method, what was the role of family and friends in this decision to take up this method, what was the quality of interaction with service providers, and what was the experience with the method, and if they had any suggestions. With service providers, we asked questions around their experience of providing the services at the public health sites, their perspectives on uptake and continuation as well as adherence to the method, and their suggestions for improving the services. Similarly, for program managers, we had questions around their experience of managing the program, their perceptions of uptake and continuation and adherence, and their suggestions for scaling up. So out of the 200, for the quantitative component, out of the 200 respondents who were enrolled, we were able to follow up with 142 respondents till a period of 6 months. Majority of them belong to the age category of 18 to 25 years. Again, most of them had at least 2 living children at the time when they opted for the method. Majority of them had not used the method previously. So this was important finding. 83% were new users of family planning method. And also majority of them had opted for this method in the immediate postpartum period. In terms of continuation rates, at 1 month, 85% clients were continuing with the method. It dropped to 65% at 3 months and 41% at 6 months. Adherence, because it has a very typical dosing pattern, adherence was very important to understand. And we found that less than half of the users were actually taking the pills as was suggested, that is on fixed days. And around 7.7% respondents said that they were taking it around the same period, the same days. 20% users reported that they had to interrupt the usage during the 6-month period. And when inquired about what were the reasons for interruption, the common reasons were clients forgot to take the pill. Some of them were not able to get the pill because of supply issues. And some of them said that they were living separately from their partners or husbands, and therefore they stopped using the method. Now, common reasons for discontinuation before 6 months. So the most common reason which came up was pain and other physiological body changes. This was reported as the most common reason. When we say pain, specifically abdominal pain was reported by most of them. Some of them also complained of pain in the legs. The second most common reason was access or supply issues. Clients reported that they couldn't get the refills when they went to the facilities. And the third most common reason was bleeding and menstrual problems. Also, among the 84 clients who discontinued, 2 women reported getting pregnant while using the method. They have been clubbed in the others category. Regarding switching patterns, amongst those who had discontinued, majority had not switched to any other method till the last follow-up was done with them. And amongst those who had switched, 50% had switched to a lesser effective method, which was either withdrawal method or condoms. We also had a qualitative component, and we synthesized some individual as well as system level facilitators and barriers to use of Centromin. So at the individual level, family support was a big facilitator. Support of husband or support of mother-in-law was a facilitator for uptake and use, whereas barriers were similarly family pressure to have a baby shortly after marriage or to have a male child. There were also myths and misconceptions in general around using pills for family planning, and also not involving the family members during the counseling was also emerged as a significant barrier. From the system level, facilitators were trust in the healthcare providers and the counseling provided by them. Dedicated counseling private spaces were also a significant facilitator. Also facility-based delivery, we can see from the quantitative data also that majority of them were postpartum. Some barriers were limited information on new methods. Because this was a new method, limited information was available in the general media. Shortage of trained human resources to either counsel or track acceptors. Counseling, the quality of counseling, information that was being provided as a part of the counseling was not complete and was a barrier. Insufficient supply or stockouts was again, a significant barrier at the system level. So what were the implications from the study? So we saw that nearly half of the users discontinued the method within 6 months. This is actually consistent with global literature that examines continuation among other pills like COCs and POP. Also, more than 2/3 of the users were new users, which basically highlighted the fact that the method was able to reach to new users and could build couples' experience with contraception. Given that most common reason for discontinuation that was reported was pain and other physiological changes, there is a need to emphasize on counseling, and that some effects are anticipated side effects. So that clearly emerged. Also, majority of women were postpartum, so integrated counseling for postpartum and family planning services could be an effective approach. There were issues with access, so supply, to sort out supply issues and maybe resupply through the field level workers who are known as ASHAs in India could be tested to reduce Centromin discontinuation. For adherence, a client held record, which could actually help the clients to capture adherence in the first 3 months, and also specifically when they have to switch from twice a week to once a week schedule. A client health record could be really helpful. And communication materials such as posters and brochures could be developed for generating fertility awareness and awareness on different types of family planning methods for the family members as well, because they are very important stakeholders in the decision of the woman to take up a family planning method. So our study had strengths as well as a few limitations. The strengths, it contributes new evidence around Centromin. There is a paucity of evidence around Centromin right now, and this study we feel does add to the evidence around Centromin. We conducted the study in 5 states across India, so diverse settings were included, and both quantitative and qualitative methodologies were used. We were able to triangulate information to generate insights. There were some limitations. There could have been a selection bias because we were following up women telephonically. So women who lacked family support for family planning may not have consented to participate in the study because that required phone calls to them. And also there were some delays in follow-ups that could have extended the recall time and therefore led to recall bias. So in the end, I would like to acknowledge support of USAID for this study, and also acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Geeta Chibbar, who is here in the audience. Thank you so much.
Dr. Yacuba's presentation is in French, so we could have Mohammed also to do some interpretation. Maybe you can, or this one? You want to sit down? Okay. Thank you very much.
OK. Merci bien, Madame la modératrice.
Thank you, Mrs. Moderator. I have the pleasure to share with you the results of a task delegation in family planning in my country, especially at community level.
Then this, there we go. So basically I was volunteered, but I'm excited about the opportunity. I'm here with Tina, and she's my colleague. I work with Medicine 360. So basically I'm just gonna literally just say what he is saying. I am Dr. Yakuba. I'm excited to be here, and I will be presenting the experience of community health services in Burkina Faso.
Merci. Et pour montrer les résultats, je vais d'abord donner l'introduction du problème, expliquer le contexte du Burkina Faso au moment où nous avons fait ce travail, et je vais montrer les résultats et les leçons apprises. You can go, okay, after. OK. Donc, comme pour introduire, mon pays en 2019, en tout cas, il y avait beaucoup d'efforts du gouvernement et des autres partenaires, mais la prévalence contraceptive n'était pas très élevée.
In my country, the contraception level was around 27% for women. And so to be able to tackle the issue, the government introduced in 2014 the BF in the range of contraceptive products. So the government also developed a national plan to accelerate family planning, so that we were able to go up to 32% uptake. Then the government adopted the task delegation policy to accelerate the offer in our national plan. So we had a regional project to accelerate or to strengthen access to DPMASC in 2021. And so we were able to extend it, so family planning to the community level. My country, of course,
And they developed objectives working with different partners. And they had a grant from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So the government went strategically thinking about increasing these rates to around 32% for 2020. Basically, the project was to accelerate the use of DMPA-SC, which is the Provera, within their strategy in terms of implementing different family planning processes.
Merci. Et donc, mon pays a un problème de ressources humaines. Il n'y a pas beaucoup d'agents de santé. Et ensuite, ce qu'il y a, ils sont pas beaucoup, ils sont mal répartis.
So after their training, the ASBC, we gave them materials so that they can work inside the community with support from the government so that they can give it to the population. So after that, we proceeded with supervision of the implementation at the district level and down to the community level. And so we talked about capacity building. Now at the level of the population, as you can see here, the health staff who had been trained provided the services to the users, about 1,200 to 1,300 women. So these women who work at community level for this service. And we also had new takers, women who had been using the pill so far and who decided to go for this DPMA, for this self injected contraceptive. So all in all, we have about 2,000 women who had access to family planning thanks to this program. And what's important is that the government had requested the two districts to recruit about 3,000 new users, and these local people were able to recruit 23%. So in the villages. Lessons learned if you work with the local administration, religious authority, etc. It helps the implementation of this activity at community level, and it's about developing tools to train the local health worker. And since they once they know how to do the job, then they so we want our country to continue developing family planning to be able to reach the objective, the contraception objectives. And in conclusion, as I showed you, all the women who were recruited at community level um, it shows that that contribution is very important because it's important to increase the prevalence of contraception at community level, especially considering the security issues the country is confronted with at the moment. It's very important.
Very much. Let's give another round of applause to all our panelists. And of course, special thanks to Mohammed for the impromptu translate. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think we're on time, and thanks to all our panelists for really keeping on time. So we are now opening for questions. Okay, so yes, Tina?
Oh, I have a question, if that's okay.
Yes,
Let's
of
see.
course.
I have questions about China. If you could answer. So I'm not that familiar with the method, and if you have data on efficacy, you mentioned it was more effective than methods that women switch to in the trial. Do you have how effective is it?
Ashish?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. So we have some data from clinical trials which have been done in India, and typical perfect use efficacy, if I were to say, has been documented around 1 to 2%, and a typical use efficacy is 6 to 7%. Yeah.
Okay, so I have questions for Dr. Yakuba, Dr. Tina, and Dr. Ashies because this is really on you really trying to identify some of the barriers, and you address them in your papers. Like for example, for Dr. Tina, you identify cost as one of the barriers, and therefore you develop another product that would bring down the cost and introduce to the and middle income countries. For Dr. Ashies, it's a new method that would really widen the choice for our women, girls, and for Dr. Yakuba, it's the introduction of the MPA subcutaneous. I really would want this to be introduced in the Philippines. So for the three of you, what do you think are the greatest achievement that you have attained in your work doing these studies and introductions of new methods? Dr. Tina?
Let's see. So I won't to speak for the investigator. So as I mentioned, this was a trial that lasted over 10 years. So it started in 2009 and actually was closed last summer, of August of 2021. So to enroll a cohort of 1,700 women, of diverse women, so not the women who are typically enrolled in clinical trials. I think that was a tremendous achievement. And so the data that we have speaks to what women can expect, what a broader cohort of women can expect if they use this method. So I would say that's probably the most important thing about the study.
And you haven't encountered any regulatory problems to countries you have introduced?
No, in fact, the study, the results of the study have contributed to expanding the indications on the label. So expanding the indication to nulliparous women, that nulliparous women can use this method. So in fact, it's been an enabler for the regulatory environment.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Ashish?
Yeah, so in terms of the study, I think, as I said, there is paucity of evidence around centromin in general. You have studies only from India, which are so far available. And all of them have been, clinical trials. So in highly controlled settings, you have data and you have the findings. Ours is probably the first study which was done, in a programmatic setting. So you have data coming from the real world setting, so to say. And I think that has been the key, value add as a result of this study.
Yeah, and I think your identification of individual and systemic barriers are really very helpful for really looking at how to introduce this in the
and
future.
further take it up as a
Yeah.
part of the program. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ashish. And Dr. Yakuba, we have Margot here who would be serving as your interpretation.
Please, I would like to tell me again in question what you want to. Ok. Le plus grand succès de ce travail, c'est de montrer que
The main success of this work is to show that task delegation is feasible, technically speaking.
Of task shifting. And for countries like Burkina, as he said, with insecurity regions and really a human resources problem, this is really a huge deal for the country.
merci.
Thank you, Margot. And yes? Yeah.
I'd just like to add something to what Ashish just mentioned. So just giving you a bit of the understanding of the policy landscape. In 2016, India actually introduced the policy environment was favorable and the commodity was introduced into the public health system. So this research study, in a sense, was nested within the program data and really has kick-started a huge other movement because the pandemic's seen a 7-fold increase in the uptake of Centromal across the country, which has now kind of gotten more people interested. And we've got a very large trial which is being done at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which is a premier research and reference institute of India, wherein they're actually prospectively now working with 500 women to generate that data, and it's kind of going to go to the pre-qualification stage with WHO as well. So I think this came at a very good time when, we could sort of give the initial findings on the method.
Thank you, thank you. That's really very useful. And speaking of human resource limitation everywhere, especially in the low and middle income countries, for Dr. Japheth, have you encountered in the task sharing review, was there any encounter on the resistance from other cadre other than nurses, midwives, and like for example, in some countries, the pharmacists are allowed to do insertion and removal of implant. Are there some resistance that it's beyond their scope of work? And what are some of the incentives that the government has provided so that the task sharing can be implemented?
Thank you very much. One aspect is that this was a desk review, so we were really looking at the policies, guidance documents. We hope to go into the interviews and some of the key informants probably will help us retrieve that information. So that is probably coming in the in-depth assessment. In terms of resistance, it was generally accepted that nurses provide IUD, nurses provide implants,